Right. Thanks, Elena. Should I get started?
Sure.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's a pleasure to speak with people. I've been actually speaking to investors about Indonesia for more than 31 years. I actually, in 1991, was on the Calbe Pharma, and Calbe Pharma, you may know, is the largest pharmaceutical company, in the country on their roadshow. And subsequent to that, at Lehman, participated in probably over 50 road shows for IPOs, a whole bunch of government road shows. So, I particularly like speaking to investors because I love the country and I love what it has to offer the world, and particularly now moving forward, what it has to offer investors at a unique moment in time in the country. And I was actually, I'm in Jakarta now, but I was in the US for most of July, speaking with investors, not public investors, but investors in private equity, hedge funds, and venture capital. And the really warm reception I received about the progress the country has made economically, politically, financially was quite something. And so I'm quite pleased to speak to you tonight. If you can do the next slide, please. Yeah, there you go. Just very quickly on us, so you can, have some perspective. Private equity is not a particularly large industry in Indonesia. There's only a few of us doing it. Falcon House really focuses on the consumer GDP demand growth across a wide range of industries. We've raised two funds. We have about $1 billion of assets under management. We're really focused on partnering with, great founders, great entrepreneurs, great businesses, helping them grow, not only with capital, but with value add, a traditional growth private equity model that I think is incredibly well suited to what's going on in Indonesia today. It is a high growth environment that requires not only this type of capital, but skill set. And we're very, very happy to be able to bring that to the country. If you could do the next page. To just give you a sense of, I've got four partners that work with me. Glenn Youssef, Pakalen, somebody who Chris, we both worked for many years ago, was one of the most prominent financial figures, in the country. Samir Suda, a longtime private equity financial expert. Henry Goliano and Alexander McCloskey, also extremely well known in financial and private equity circles in the country. The five of us run Falcon House out of Jakarta and Singapore. The next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of our portfolio, so you get an insight in our investing mindset. Probably the most well-known asset, on this page, is Potato Head. Anybody who's ever been to Indonesia, to Bali, hopefully has visited Potato Head. It's one of the most iconic brands, in the country. But we're also one of the largest full-service restaurant owners. We're a leading healthcare investor, consumer products. We recently invested in the largest e-commerce, or the second largest e-commerce logistics platform in C Cepat. Food manufacturing, retail. So a wide range of businesses that really focus on the Indonesian consumer and demand-driven growth, GDP growth in the country. And it's a strategy that's worked very well for us and for our investors. And I suspect that'll be the same moving forward. But what I really want to talk about, is Indonesia itself. If you could slip to the next slide. As I said, I've been doing this for a long time, beginning in the early 1990s. And there's, five boxes on this page, and Indonesia really had two and a half of them for most of that period since the early 1990s. It's always had, a consumer-driven economy, and it's always had great demographics. Commodities has been cyclical. It's come and go depending on global commodity cycles, but that's changing, and I'll speak to that in a bit later. But where Indonesia is really driving aggressively forward is productivity, led by massively increased investment in infrastructure, under President Jokowi, as well as FDI and investment, whether it's the omnibus law, various different reforms that have taken place, during the Jokowi administration. You're seeing record FDI in the country, and as we're seeing coming out of COVID, record domestic capital investment as well. It's really a unique moment in time for the country. And I suspect that we'll see some significant outperformance of Indonesia relative to most emerging markets over the next decade. If you could change the next slide, please. Not only do you have this secular high GDP growth, moving forward, but Indonesia is critically important globally now, both politically, from a commodities perspective, militarily, and as a result of that, the country's economy will benefit. Many people don't know Indonesia for being a country with significant financial stability, but in fact, it's one of the most stable emerging markets in the world, if not the most stable, and I'll touch on that in a second. And it's got a government that's demonstrated incredibly smart and responsible policy making, both on the fiscal side and the monetary side, during this very difficult COVID period, and I'll speak to that. And lastly, it's really in a new position from a global mega trends perspective. Digitalization is something that's overtaken the country. Since 2016, there's been over $30 billion through venture capital invested, in the country, which has been incredible and benefits for businesses and consumers. Decarbonization is a big theme here. Supply chain diversification as China continues to have trouble. And so there's really so many things to talk about, Indonesia. I'm going to dive into a slight amount of detail on some of these things. If you can turn to the next slide, please. I think some of these points have been touched on previously. I just want to mention, something that hasn't been mentioned, and that is, Indonesia is a thriving democracy with freedom of the press, a constitution modeled after the United States, which is pretty unique. But it's also struck a incredibly important strategic balance between the increasingly bipolarized world of the U.S. and its allies on one side, and China and its allies on the other side. It's managed to be friends and investment partners with all parties, and this has been a particularly strong skill of Jokowi, and historically in Indonesia, its political leaders have been able to thread the needle, between balancing powers, and as we go forward, and in these times, geopolitical, volatility, if you will, Indonesia has even a more important role to play. Next, please. So before Indonesia and the last commodities boom in 2009 to 2013, primarily driven by thermal coal, was very cyclical. We expect, though, that the benefits of this commodities boom will be secular, primarily because the commodities which Indonesia produces are going to be significant contributors to the electrification of the world. Indonesia is the largest nickel producer in the world. We control about 30% of nickel reserves. Tin, number one. Bauxite, the number 3 exporter. Copper, number 6. All of these are incredibly important, as you know, for the electrification of energy. And not only that, traditional energy stalwarts such as thermal coal, where we're the largest exporter, in natural gas, because of underinvestment in these areas, in addition to palm oil, we expect structurally high prices in Indonesia to benefit, for some time to come, right? Which is one of the reasons you've seen Indonesia's currency outperform most currencies during COVID, and again during periods of high global economic volatility. One would expect, based on historical precedent, to see the rupiah, be highly volatile, but in fact the opposite was happening. Next page, please. Many people like look at Indonesia and they think immediately coal and palm oil and these things, and it's a big commodities producer. But in fact, it's one of the biggest consumer economies in the world. And the Indonesian consumer is perennially optimistic. They like to spend, more than they like to save. And that's why Indonesia, through good times and bad, sees high secular economic growth. Indonesia, even in 2008, during the depths of the global financial crisis, grew at 4%. And that's one of the strongest points of the economy is its diversification. What we've seen recently is investment has increased, which we like to see for long-term sustainable growth once the demographic dividend diminishes, in about 10 years. The other interesting thing about this slide, and I'll point again and again to highly responsible government policymaking is the government's only about 10% of GDP. That compares to European economies up to 35, 40% of GDP. It runs a very lean and mean, government with low budget deficits, which I think as an investor, is very attractive. Next slide, please. This is what I mentioned before. This is a pretty astonishing slide. People have been around Indonesia, way back in the 2000s and 1990s. You saw sometimes $3 to $5 billion a year being put into infrastructure. Since President Jokowi took over, we're seeing $50+ billion a year, 2.5% of GDP put into infrastructure. Which it's living in Jakarta, you feel every day. Traveling around the country, you feel every day. Owning businesses that benefit from better logistics, you feel it every day. It's really transforming the country, and it's something that I think goes largely unrecognized in the investment community, and it continues, and it will pay dividends for many years to come. Next slide, please. I mentioned this digitalization, happening. We're not VC investors, but our businesses really benefit from all the VC investment, being put in. And $33 billion when you've got $1 trillion economy is, quite a large number. Hundreds of businesses, B2B businesses, B2C businesses, e-commerce, fintech, health tech, agri-tech. There's over 130 venture capital firms that are institutionalized investing in Indonesia today. And, it's really transforming the country, and helping businesses and consumer and government and financial institutions leapfrog in terms of productivity. And it's something you're just starting to see the benefits of today. Next slide. And I'll just conclude. I'm running out of time here and talk about unrivaled stability.
Please feel free to take as much time as possible. To finish your presentation. No worries.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always talk about is how investors misprice the risk of Indonesia. And I'll touch on some specifics here. But first of all, you've got an incredibly strong banking system. The capital adequacy ratios in the Indonesian banking system are north of 24%. It's one of the best capitalized banking systems in the world. In fact, you could really argue that it's too conservative. It's too hard to get a loan in this country. Loan growth is too slow. The banks are too tough, and that probably slows down economic growth. But it makes for a very, very stable system. You've also got a current account and trade surplus. Disciplined financial and monetary management. And if you turn on the next slide, one of the more interesting statistics in global emerging markets is this, which is if you look at Indonesia over the past, if you ask yourself, what's the least volatile emerging market? And in fact, the least volatile country in the world from a GDP perspective, you'd never guess Indonesia. But in fact, it's the least volatile growth economy in the world, which makes, as an investor, predicting outcomes more certain and reduces the risk premium on making investments in the country. If you go to the next slide. This is one that the country can be particularly proud of. It's got the lowest debt to GDP of any major emerging market and any major, economy in the world. Quite frankly, we're at about 83% of GDP, versus, the rest of Asia and India pushing 175 to 200%. Places like China, the US, Japan, depending how you calculate it, up to 300%. This makes for a much less volatile credit environment, less volatile FX environment. And again, from an investor perspective, easier to operate in. And the risk premium, as I said, for the country is, I think, a lot less than people project. And having operated in the country for a long period of time, I will tell you that this wasn't the case in 2007, 2008, where you had a massive credit imbalance in the country. But the policymakers really fixed it, and the banking system and the financial system is incredibly well run now. Next page. And this slide shocks everybody. When I showed it in New York, even last week, that Indonesia is the only major the Bank Indonesia is the only central bank that actually shrank their balance sheet during COVID, right? Which is one of the reasons you have controlled inflation in the country. Inflation, we're at 3.5 to 4.5%, compared to 9.5% was the late, and north of that in the United States and elsewhere. Again, points to the fact that the country is very disciplined in the way it runs its monetary system and physical system. But it's an impressive performance by Bank Indonesia. Next. Yeah, and I'll just summarize. I think I've hit on all these points. You can tell I'm very biased for Indonesia. I think it's a pretty unique moment in time in the country. The president has done a terrific job. His cabinet's done a terrific job, and really makes it easy, or easier. It's never easy in the emerging markets, but easier for investors to come and make money in the country and participate in all the growth and all the mega trends that are really driving returns and will continue to drive returns in the country. So I'll stop there.